Good morning, everyone. It is Wednesday in May. I think it's the 27th. I'm just going to check that though. We're right. So welcome to the last week of May, to this devotional time together. We have been walking our way through James, and we will continue that today and tomorrow. And then I will tomorrow let you know about our June plans. The Wednesday, Thursday devotionals will continue through June, and we will be doing a study together. Instead of doing one book of the Bible, we are going to look at a few different places, following the guidance of Walter Brueggemann, who is a scholar in particular, the Hebrew Bible. And he is going to guide us as we learn more about the practice and discipline of Sabbath, which is Roberts and Wesley's theme for June. But in May, we have been wrestling with the letter from the community of James. James was from a community of Jewish Christians who still felt very much at home, but also very much faithful to the traditions of the Jewish people, the ethical guidelines and standards that they had in the time after Jesus died. James's community was built probably from the disciple named James, but more importantly in Acts, you will find James as one of the leaders of the Jerusalem community. He always was in tension with Paul, who lived around the same time or died just shortly before this letter was written. We are unsure on the exact date. Their main disagreement was, do people of faith need to relax into grace and do well as they can? Or do we need to remember grace, but use it to be pulled forward into right action? James is most famous for be doers of the word and not hearers only. So good morning to the both of you and to all the others who are joining. If you can put in a hello or maybe where you're watching from, that helps us know who we are gathered with in spirit. I know some folks wait and watch this on the weekend, and that is wonderful too. You are still with us in spirit. Been using two translations to help us walk through James. Whichever translation you have at home is perfect. If you notice there's differences in my readings to yours, we will note a few of those today, places that are often differently translated or talked about different in a paraphrase. And that is one of the gifts and challenges we have with the Bible is that it has been written in languages that are no longer spoken. You need to take special classes to learn the Greek that is used in writing the Christian scriptures. The letters were written in Greek, and it is a biblical Greek, no longer spoken. It would be like needing to learn Shakespearean English. It is ancient in its use. And so as Latin, German, and finally English translators, and now translators into every language, they struggle to find the right words. Writers of letters talk both from their heart and their mind and their tradition. So they sometimes have an intent, say Paul's sarcasm, that's very hard to translate. Sometimes when you translate sarcasm or you see a text that someone means to be sarcastic, if you don't catch the sarcasm, it can be very much a different message. Sometimes Paul uses sarcasm. James is a bit more straightforward, at least how we have him translated in the English. So let us turn ourselves to James's 4th chapter. Those conflicts and disputes among you, where do they come from? Do they not come from your cravings that are at war within you? You want something and do not have it, so you commit murder. You covet, envy something and cannot obtain it, so you engage in disputes and conflicts. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and you do not receive because you ask wrongly, in order to spend what you get on your pleasures. Adulterers, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world becomes an enemy of God. Or do you suppose that it is nothing? The scripture says, God yearns jealously for the Spirit that he has made to dwell in us. But God gives all the more grace. Therefore, it says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. I don't know when the last time someone shouted loudly at you, adulterer. It's a word we do not use to describe people that we don't know. And it is a shaming word, meaning it can paint someone's character, not just their behavior. So I always want to remind us that in the biblical tradition, adultery, marriage, flirtation, all of these images are not actually usually about marriage between two humans. Often in the biblical literature, marriage is the metaphor for the relationship we are to have with God and with our community. The first thing that sets apart the Hebrew people is their relationship with God being intimate, distinct. God called Abraham and Sarah by name. He actually called them Abram and Sarai. And then, once they turned, recognizing their name, he gave them new names. So they literally had names given to them from the voice of God. Their defining characteristics were that they were in relationship with God. The prophet Hosea is the most famous user of this metaphor, and we're not sure how much he lived this out, but he was called by God to marry someone who was in the sex trade and marry someone who wasn't, and to talk about the difference, to experience what it was like to have one relationship based on commodification and one relationship based on commitment and faithfulness. We're not sure if Hosea actually historically married two different people, maybe, but he definitely taught about it in a way that said, in our relationships with God, we are to be true. We are to always hold true to the values God has given us and to the wisdom of our community, the traditions of our community and religion, and learn to better ourselves, to grow in faith, to mature in faith. And James is very clear that when we desire something that is not ours, that is based on pleasure, comfort, based on having more than we need, that too is like a seed within us. That too can be incubated and protected and fed, which gives birth to sin. He uses that image of giving birth to sin in the first chapter, and he warns that money and riches is a crucial thing to avoid because of what it makes us nourish as opposed to what God wants us to nourish. Truth, serving of the other, serving and uplifting the poor. Here, James is talking about the fact that all the 10 commandments, we are drawn to those activities when we break some other commandments. It's when we covet, when we envy something someone else has, that we would be tempted to steal or tempted to hurt someone. It is when we envy something on the other side of the fence that we may be tempted to commit adultery, which for me is a broader term than outside of marriage relationships. Adultery in the biblical sense is wider. It means not being faithful to one's vows, including one's vow to be faithful to God and be in relationship with God. James starts this whole conversation with, so are you in conflict with anyone right now? James notes that even the smallest conflict usually comes out of us wanting something, craving it, coveting it, seeking our pleasure over another's. The smallest disputes come from that. He then reminds us that to be friends with the world, to seek after the things the world says is successful, that's going to mean us turning our back on the things God is hoping for us. And vice versa, that if we keep turned towards God's hopes for us, the world will resist, will become our enemy. The next verse, 7, I do always stop at. I do so not because it isn't important, but because it has the image of the devil. In Eugene Peterson's paraphrase, he uses the name Satan. The term Jesus most often used was adversary. Now, in some Christian traditions, the adversary has been given personification, in that some folk believe the devil to be about us, independent of us, in a sense, godlike. Other faith traditions and other Christian traditions say that the adversary are those parts of the world, society, structures, and our inner instincts for safety, for having more than we need. These are our adversaries, and they are more forces than a personified individual. The question of evil is not one for online learning, because it is more complex than this format allows. But as we listen to the rest of this verse from James, I want you to know, to have permission, that when I say devil or Satan, adversary, to think for yourself of something that draws you, that you know has never given you life. It is something you may be drawn to having too much of, that has actually only ever caused headaches. A simple example is, wouldn't it be great to have 4 beautiful cars? But then you have to look after 4 beautiful cars. Wouldn't it be great to have a big house? Oh, who's going to clean that house? Working towards paying the mortgage for the house. Well, am I working overtime and actually losing time on life? What are the things that you find can draw your focus away from you becoming your best self? James invites you to submit yourself to God rather than those forces. Verse 7. Submit yourselves, therefore, to God. Resist the devil, and the adversary will flee from you. Draw near to God, and God will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, you double-minded. Lament, mourn, and weep. Let your laughter be turned into mourning and your joy into dejection. Humble yourself before the Lord. In that, God will exalt you. Here, James is noting that while before this in the letter, he spoke a lot about the actions we take with our body in the external world. He reminds us that both sin and faith can be nurtured and are internal works to be done actively. To actively submit ourselves to God, to take a moment, and while the world is calling us to find happiness, to take time to truly sense, where have we been double-minded? Where have we separated ourselves from God, from our hopes and dreams of becoming better selves? What are some ways we have drawn ourselves into habits that are not good for us? Take time to feel the feelings associated with that. So, for example, in prayer practices that use our bodies, there is a practice in the prayer of confession where one not only bends one's head, but actually curls down on the floor, placing our hands behind us and our forehead to the floor. It is a physical way to say, I am small and little. Now, you may not be able to physically do this. Or some of people have said, I couldn't do it, but I can't get back up. But I want you to find a way sometime in the next day to see what it feels like to physically live out guilt or fear, mourning decisions that have led to places of deficit, either financial deficit or deficit of relationships. To find a place where you can say to God, oh, that feels rotten. You don't need to feel perhaps guilt, but you may. The important thing, though, is to remember it is okay to have those feelings. God will then come and be with you. The way to sense that is hearing this verse 10, this humbling, this confessing of true self, of our coveting, of our envy, of our greed, jealousy. God says, humble yourself before me and I will exalt you. And so God will invite you to lift up your head, lift up your body, open up your shoulders. For as much as you have feelings of inadequacy or guilt or shame, you also have the ground of your faith that says, you are a beloved child of God. God is indwelling in you. And as you let go of anxiety, of lament and mourning, as you give that away, space will be made so that you can begin again to focus on God, on God's faithfulness. Begin again every day your journey to become a better who you are, to grow into the most mature, best self you can. Never striving for perfection, but rather striving to make the small steps every day. Now we are in the book of James. So while he has this deep spiritual wish for you to feel feelings and pray and be exalted by God, he also is still worried about what you are going to do externally, how you are going to use your words and your actions. And so by verse 11, he's pulling you back into how will you behave tomorrow? Verse 11, do not speak evil against one another, siblings of Christ. Whoever speaks evil against another or judges another speaks evil against the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law. You're a judge of the law. Now, there is only one lawgiver. There is only one judge who is able to save or destroy. So then, who are you to be judge to your neighbor? We are called to speak to one another with love, but not go about with the law in our hand and the judge's gavel in our mind. The other theme of James that we've noted is money. He's always concerned that the rich will be too comfortable. They will not act out their faith. They will, in a sense, think that they don't need to plan for it, or they'll plan so far ahead they'll forget about it. Forget about living it out today. And so in verse 13, he does return us to that theme as well. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to such and such, in such a town. We'll spend a year there doing business, making money. You don't even know what tomorrow is going to bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wishes, we will live. We will do this or do that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. Anyone then who knows the right thing to do and fails to do it commits sin, separates themselves from acknowledging and knowing God. We must remember that we are here but for a moment, and spending our days planning for a long-term future while neglecting how we behave in the moment. It won't allow us to know God, to follow Christ, to serve the poor, and to resist the evil around us. As you know, we've been also looking at Eugene Peterson's paraphrase. This is called The Message. It is a biblical paraphrase that Eugene Peterson wrote. In particular, he started with the Christian scriptures, wanting to surprise us again, to remind us how startling this news was, that our behavior and our faith mattered to God. So much so that Jesus came to learn and be human, to preach, to heal, to show us that even beyond death, God is with us. If all you want is your way, flirting with the world every chance you get, you end up enemies of God and God's way. Do you suppose now that God doesn't care? The proverb says that God is a fiercely jealous lover, and that what God gives in love is far better than anything else you'll find. It's common knowledge that God goes against the willful proud, and God gives grace to the willing humble. And so let God work this will and way in you. Yell a loud no to the adversary. Watch him scamper. Say a quiet yes to God, and God will be there in no time. Now quit dabbling in sin. Purify your inner life. Quit playing the field now. Hit bottom, cry your eyes out. The fun and games are over. Get serious, really serious. Get down on your knees before the Master, before our God. It's the only way you're going to get up on your feet. I'm not sure how you've been finding this time, but I'm wondering if you have felt more tempted lately. We are entering a phase in our time of being either confined or having very different work environments due to COVID. In these times, some of us have much stricter routines. As I listen to healthcare workers who used to get up early, go to work, come home, wash their hands, be with their family. These healthcare workers are now needing to take separate changes of clothing, to take full showers and do laundry between coming home and seeing their family. Some of them are not even going home, but rather staying in hotels and other places so as not to have the potential of bringing COVID home. Other people are working from home, and so while they have again the same kind of content of their day, they are doing it in a place of much different surroundings. Distractions can abound. And yet others have been laid off or are unable to go to work because of either a government or a rule from a government or employer. These folk have free time, which isn't actually free. It is also full of distractions, worries, and much stress. In my time, I've been finding myself more tempted by certain things than I used to be. When I worked at the church physically during the day, I was always tempted to have a third cup of coffee, and I was usually tempted to grab a cookie at the bakery next door at least a couple times a week. At home, that third cup of coffee is also always tempting, but the cookies, they're there much more often. The bed is closer, so the afternoon nap feels easier. Or if I have an anxious task or a task that's making me feel anxious, I can avoid it by doing something good, like laundry or the dishes. I'm tempted to do those things that help me be distracted from my laments, which are at times guilt for having followed a temptation, but also grieving life as I knew it. Grieving gatherings, hugs, being able to go into work and not worry what I touched or who I saw and how close I was to them. Imagine the freedom of no longer having that anxiety. And so I lament and mourn, and I'm tempted to distract myself from those uncomfortable feelings much more when I'm working from home. For others, it might be temptations to overindulge in something because they're working so hard. The anxiety in a hospital room now is much higher than it was before, and it was not low before. And so coming home from a day at the hospital may tempt us to a cookie, a drink, to a phone call to someone who won't actually make us feel better. These temptations to distraction are normal. And James always asks us to return to our inner life and share with God honestly what's going on. This Sunday, Reverend Karen had many examples of ways we can have deep feelings in this time. And there was a plethora of them she had received from people. Everything from deep sadness to bright anger, to apathy, to boredom. All those are part of the grieving process as we learn to live in this new normal. And within all of them will come temptations. James would say, when tempted, take a moment. Come back to your inner life that you want. Come back to the values you want to live out. Come back and lament with God your true feelings. And then, after kneeling down, you will be able to be lifted back up, invited into having an apple instead of a cookie, to forgoing the drink altogether, or to calling someone you know will bring you back to your true self, a spiritual friend or guide. May we, as we continue in this time of difference, of anxiety, continue to remember that our faith and our behavior impact one another. And they can push and pull. And that if we allow God to be right in the middle there, both will be stronger. Both will be able to make choices that allow the most vulnerable among us to be safe and to share our wealth with all. May you pray this night, and may God fill you up with love. We will see you tomorrow. Have a blessed day.